I was privileged to work in the government of Kenya's third president, Mwai Kibaki, as Kenya's representative in a Pan-African initiative called NEPAD. Some of you may remember NEPAD. NEPAD is an acronym for the New Partnership for Africa's Development. NEPAD was a high-profile initiative that was the brainchild of the then South African president, Thabo Mbeki. It was a novel idea that was designed to unite African countries around a common economic agenda. For the first time ever, Africa had a framework where African nations could sit together and develop common cross-border plans and projects instead of every country working on its own. I attended many meetings where our heads of state came together not to discuss politics, but to actually deliberate on and make joint decisions on projects and programs that were framed around Africa's priorities and needs. The spirit behind NEPAD, as I understood it, was that Africa will no longer be the world's charity case to be helped by the West, but rather a self-respecting body of people who would come to the negotiating table with its Western partners, not as a beggar continent seeking to be helped with aid, but as an equal partner to any negotiation. African professionals, scholars, civil society groups, and business people, they bought into the idea. And you could sense that this could be a catalytic moment, a catalyst that would actually place Africa on a new trajectory. And all this had the political backing of governments who signed up to the initiative and actually contributed money to a central pool. They even created a peer review mechanism through which they would hold each other accountable. It was unprecedented. So you may ask, what went wrong? Well, I'm sure you've heard the expression, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. Something happened in 2004 that convinced me that we have some work to do to convince ourselves to believe that we can actually be masters of our own destiny. It also showed me that the Western world is not ready to deal with an Africa that has its own agenda. The events that I want to share with you came at a time when, for different reasons, the word poverty was the in thing. The United Nations had, a few years earlier, come up with the so-called Millennium Development Goals, which, among other things, set out to reduce global poverty by half in a 15-year period. Everyone was talking about poverty, 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 like it was a new fad. People were writing books and celebrities were holding concerts, all in the name of poverty. And so, in 2004, Tony Blair, the then UK Prime Minister, out of the blues, launched an initiative called the Commission for Africa. Many people came to know it as the Blair Commission. You can look it up. In launching the commission, Mr. Blair gave a speech in which he famously said, Africa is a scar on the world's conscience. And his proposition was that the world community, meaning the Western world, should rally together and come up with a plan that would emancipate Africa from poverty. Later that same year, that is 2004, the NEPAD steering committee, made up of about 12 African heads of state, met in Maputo, Mozambique, for their quarterly NEPAD discussions. I was there as part of the Kenya delegation. At the beginning of the meeting, one of the presidents, I think it was President Chisano of Mozambique, he asked the chairman, President Obasanjo of Nigeria, what this Blair Commission was all about. President Obasanjo shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know. President Mbeki, who was sitting next to Obasanjo, said, in what sounded like an agitated voice, should we not have been at least consulted? The room fell silent for a moment. The point was, here were the leaders of the African continent in a gathering that was supposedly setting the African agenda. And somewhere in Europe, the British Prime Minister had launched a parallel initiative that was supposed to be setting a global agenda for the continent, and the two were not talking to each other. President Obasanjo eventually broke the silence and he said that he would call Mr. Blair to try to get some clarification. In July of the following year, that is 2005, The annual meeting of the G8 nations, basically the 8 powerhouses of the world, was scheduled to be held at a place called Glen Eagles, Scotland. Because of his position and influence, Mr. Blair had managed to put his commission's poverty agenda at the center of the planned G8 meeting. Many African heads of state, including members of the NEPAD steering committee, were invited to attend the meeting as observers, basically to give credence to Blair's initiative. They were coming to the meeting not to champion their African agenda, but as invited guests to endorse the Blair Commission. I was not accredited to attend that meeting, but I happened to be in London for some related meetings, and I remember so well on the morning of July 7th, 2005, to be precise, the day before the G8 meeting was to begin. A group of terrorists suspected to be affiliated with Al-Qaeda detonated bombs at 3 crowded London subways and 1 bus during the peak of the city's rush hour. The suicide bombings reportedly killed 56 people, including the bombers, and injured another 700 or so people. It was pretty bad. Needless to say, the G8 meeting was scuttled and never took place. In an instant, the global attention shifted from Africa, and terrorism suddenly took center stage. The Blair Commission was shelved, just like that. Imagine, we had dropped the ball on a homegrown African initiative that may not have been perfect, but had some promise, to jump on the bandwagon of a European leader's idea of what the world should do for Africa. And now, that too was gone. The African leaders who had trooped to Scotland that day, hoping to come home with some goodies, returned home empty-handed. And Africa returned to its all too familiar position of sitting without a plan and waiting for someone out there to come up with another scheme to help us out of our mess. And so you may ask, is there any hope? Is there a chance that African nations can put aside their differences, come together to define a common pathway for Africa's development? My answer is yes. Let me tell you, no one could have imagined that in 2020, the world would be plunged in the worst economic crisis in recent memory. But with the advent of the COVID-19 crisis, we suddenly find ourselves at a moment that presents an opportunity for Africa to pause and hit the reset button on its relationship with the rest of the world. The world is undergoing a painful transition that is going to redefine many things, including power structures and the way that nations align themselves with each other. I believe that the paradigm of developed and developing nations is going to change. Even the very concept of development may be discarded. African nations, which have for so many years depended on the so-called developed nations to facilitate its development, will be forced to reconfigure their survival strategies when those taps begin to run dry. In spite of the pain and loss that we may experience during this transition, there is a silver lining in the dark cloud. As the late Napoleon Hill once said, the turning point in the life of those who succeed usually comes at the moment of some crisis. So where do we begin with this new journey? It begins here. It begins with what we choose to believe about ourselves. The elephant in the room is our thinking. We can design the most sophisticated development projects, write fancy papers about development, hold development conferences, but if we don't believe that we can climb out of whatever pit life has put us in, there's no point in even trying. All things are possible to them who believe. And to borrow the words of a famous son of Kenya, yes, we can.